Hello, and welcome to Talking Toddlers, where I share more than just tips and tricks on how to reduce tantrums or build your toddler's vocabulary. We're going to cover all of that, I assure you. But here, our goal is to develop clarity, because in this modern world, it's truly overwhelming, especially during these past 2 years. This podcast is about empowering moms to know the difference between fact and fiction, to never give up, to tap into everyday activities so your child stays on track. He's not falling behind, he's thriving through your guidance. We know that true learning starts at home, and Talking Toddlers, this podcast helps you develop that with clarity, confidence, and clear communication. So let's get started. Hello, and welcome back to Talking Toddlers. I'm Erin Heyer, your host, and this week I'm going to debunk 5 huge brain myths that just won't seem to go away. I realize that, change is hard for most people, that we're creature of habits, and it takes a lot of work and effort to go upstream to verify. But there are other reasons that these myths seem to be just embedded in our lives. And one of them, the most obvious, I think, is that companies seem to make money off of them. And I'll explain a little bit more what that all means later on, or as I cover each of the 5 brain myths that need to be busted for parents, mostly, because that's who I'm talking to on this podcast, but also childcare providers and educators. You are being misled. And if you listen through all 5 of them, you'll know exactly what I mean. So with that, it just is so frustrating and harmful, I think, to parents, the kids across the board, and that our school systems are being set up and modified each and every year to make policies that come out of these bizarre brain myths, or neuromyths, they're now referred to, that are inaccurate, distorted, misleading, and I think quite often the people that are driving this understand exactly what they're doing. So the first one I want to talk about, brain myth number 1, is, quote, "We only use a fraction of our brains, approximately 10%. And it just blows my mind that this is still pretty well accepted as dogma or as fact. And it seems to have gained credible legs back in 2014 with the movie called Lucy. I'm not sure if you've watched it, but I'm sure you were kind of inundated with the advertisements where Scarlett Johansson and Morgan Freeman, his beautiful, rich, lusty voice, says, quote, "The average person uses 10% of their brain capacity." And coming from Morgan Freeman's beautiful voice, it's got to be true. I think once or twice in movies, he actually played God. So it's just this brainwashing, no pun intended, into the mainstream average person out there thinking that this is true, and it simply isn't. Let me just kind of bear down some facts. Yes, in the last 100 years, technology really has advanced so much that we have really begun to see what's happening inside of our brain while doing certain tasks. And so we have gained great knowledge and understanding of the brain functions, or the brain processing and networks, such as, the EEG or a PET scanner and MRI machines and functional MRIs. I know when they came out, I think in the late 80s, early 1990s, it really changed a lot of the neuroscience that I followed, understanding what's going on in real time with these functional MRI machines. But through all of this technological advances, all of this research, and there are hundreds and hundreds every single year. Never once has there been reported that there's a quote unquote quiet or unused part of the brain. Let's take a look at this logically, okay? So if we only use 10% on average, the average person out there, that's what this myth states, wouldn't we be hearing in the scientific communities that there are new discoveries that this part of the brain has kind of started to develop or grow, or maybe they're, honing in on the upper left quadrant? No, we use 100% of our brain on any given day. The fact is we don't use it all simultaneously. So it's kind of suggesting that if we only use 10%, what the heck is the other 90% doing? Just like hanging out, just taking up, real estate space? I mean, that's just bizarre to me. Yeah. And then we take a look, I come from rehabilitation, right? The brain trauma, before I went into private practice. I've mentioned this before. So let's think about what happens to individuals who do have a stroke or a head trauma, and that's children and adolescents and adults alike. It usually occurs in a very small area, and that kind of impact or infarct, that's what we call them, can really disrupt specific speech and language processing. You can get very specific with motor, the left side paralysis or the right side swallowing disorders. If you have a frontal lobe head trauma, in a car where you hit the windshield, there's judgment and reasoning with that frontal lobe. So I just think it's really kind of crazy that there's still this kind of background feeling or understanding belief that we only use 10% of our brain, and that educators really seem to kind of hold true to that too. So here's a neuroscientist who kind of looks at all of this too. His name is Dr. Larry Squire, and he's reported to say any place in the brain that's damaged, there is a consequence. So that leads us to believe that we use 100% of our brain. Okay, so now here's myth number 2. Playing classical music to infants makes them smarter. Wow. I was in the middle of developing my practice there in Southern California when this kind of hit the markets. And, teasing back, and there are a lot of good websites currently that are trying to bust these brain myths as well. So all you have to do is Google any one of these and you'll get all kinds of information. But it kind of started in 1998. So I was a good, 10 years in my practice. And it seems to stem from the state of Georgia, where they began distributing classical music CDs to families who have just, given birth to a new baby. And with each one of these CDs of classical music, there was a little note by the governor that said, quote, "I hope both you and your baby enjoy it, and that your little one will get off to a smart start." And it's kind of interesting for me kind of being in the middle of this because, the private sector, this private speech and language pathologist, the occupational therapist, neuropsychologists, neuroscientists, we're all kind of looking at each other, scratching our head and saying, where the heck did this come from? So I recognize that in the early to mid 90s, brain science and neuroplasticity, that means that the brain changes based on its life experience, was just in its infancy and just kind of bubbling up into the mainstream. At the same time, the home computer was also being, readily available to the average person out there, or the average wannabe scientist. And I think, we started looking at research and then extrapolating these kind of very simplistic statements that were really based in complex science. And I think that, I don't think it was purposeful initially, but people have taken the ball and run with it. Educators or policymakers within the educational system, politicians who kind of, fund these policies, and it just has snowballed over and over and over again. So in digging deeper on the history of where do these brain myths come from, it seems back in 1993, so it was about 5 years prior to what, the governor did in Georgia. There was a study at the University of California, Irvine, where 36 college students, so first you have to look at that methodology. There are only 36 subject matters in this study, and they were college age. But these students seemed to perform better on an IQ test after listening to Mozart as compared to a group of people who relaxed, used relaxation exercises, or just sat in silence. So if there's 36 subject matters, that means 36 divided by 3, because there are 3 groups that they looked at. That's only, 12 subject matters per group. So with that in mind, they determined that there was a quote unquote Mozart effect. The interesting thing is, as of today in 2022, no one has been able to replicate those results. And digging a little bit deeper, we also see that when you look back at that one primary research article, jump in their ability to, it was only under spatial recognition as well, but their ability to score higher in that one single category lasted for about 15 or 20 minutes. It wasn't even long term. So as I continue to deep dive into where this neuromyth came from, it seemed in 1998, so the year following Georgia's release of classical CDs, a Harvard University study reviewed 16 similar studies as the one at UC Irvine and concluded that the Mozart effect was certainly debunked. It wasn't real at all, and that the methodology, the way that these experiments were set up, were incredibly weak. The interesting part, again, I was in Southern California in the middle of Disney and Hollywood and all of this. Very quietly, Disney, because they started to sell and promote, CDs and getting, and I saw a ton of moms, some friends, some colleagues that would plop their, newborn, 3 months, 6 months, 18 months in front of the TV, and they would have all these little visualizations as they listened to Mozart music. But Disney quietly realized that this was a bunch of hogwash, and the one and only time they ever gave money back to a consumer, that if you called and questioned the efficacy of this, or that it didn't help your child or this or that, they would just give 100% refund. That is the only time Disney has ever refunded quote unquote educational or developmental products. And I was in the middle of it, and it was like, wow, that's interesting. But it was still available, at Target or Walmart. But if the parent was savvy enough and realized that this was, some snake oil, they were able to get their money back. That I find interesting. And yet still to this day, that music, Mozart or classical music, is really being pushed upon to increase your toddler or your newborn's IQ. Now, I do want to kind of clarify there is a wealth of good, strong research, and I won't dive too deeply into it right now, but playing or having your child take lessons with a musical instrument that requires moving their fingers, so on a keyboard or a string instrument or a wind instrument like a horn or a clarinet, there's a lot of good scientific evidence to support that that connection of learning how to read music and the timing, the motor planning is really helping to wire the brain, especially with higher order language processing. So it doesn't suggest that you're going to have a higher IQ. There's some other studies, and in a later episode, I'll dive a little bit deeper of what music does and doesn't do for us, or how it can support higher order thinking and problem solving and such that. But that's very different than sitting and listening to passive Mozart, which is beautiful. I do, truly believe that music should be part of the rich home life and environment. It can help relax us and make us feel calm. It can set us in a certain mood. Music can also stimulate you and want to dance around the living room. And I think all of that, the whole range, should be part of your child's early development and beyond, right? Beyond, of course. Now, moving on to brain myth number 3 is that some people are right-brained or creative versus left brain, more logical. And I hate to break this to you guys, but that is debunked. It is really, really a myth. And I think there's just so much science into the last, as I said, the last 30 years, but the last 60 years, and really looking at the brain and how it grows and develops, how, we can help brains that have been traumatized, both physically and emotionally. But, there's been some remarkable research done. And again, what I think happens is this research is done, it's controlled in an, research environment, and the average person out there will then take a thread of truth and then extrapolate this whole myth, this whole belief. So regarding the right brain creatives versus the left brain logical-minded individuals, it kind of started way back in the 1960s, where a researcher, a neuropsychologist named Roger Sperry at the California Institute of Technology, Caltech, and is right there in Pasadena where I was for 25 years. What he and his team did were they cut the fibers which connect the two brain's hemispheres. It's called the corpus callosum. And they had to do this with very severe epileptic patients. And it was just a handful of patients that they did this test with, because they just could not, medication at that time was not helping them reduce or eliminate their seizures. And so during this experiment, what Dr. Sperry and his team did was kind of flash these images, whether they're letters or lights, numbers, into the right eye versus the left eye, and then recorded how the different hemispheres, you may or may not be aware of this or remember this, but the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body, right? The right eye, the right ear, your arm and your leg. And then your right hemisphere controls your left side of your body. So for example, if you do have, a stroke on your right side, you could have paralysis on, or semi-paresis, even not, full-blown paralysis on your left side of your body. But so his research really looked and found that the left hemisphere seemed to process verbal information better, and that the right hemisphere seemed to process visual and spatial information better. And so what happened, moving beyond the 60s, where Dr. Sperry and his team really looked at these highly, highly specialized procedures, and interestingly enough, they now refer to it as the split brain experiment. With these patients, they completely severed the communication system, the network, the fibers between the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. And so, but this kind of complex study and experiment for these handful of patients really over the next several decades, the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even in the 2000s, misinterpreted and used dominance, the word dominant, instead of lateralized. And so that's a big difference of word usage in when you look at scientific research. And so they kind of then the snowball was you have all of these self-help books. I bet you and I and everybody has taken some kind of quote unquote personality or hemispheric dominance trait test online. We even, did it in college probably. But there, to date, here again in 2022, there's absolutely no evidence to support the quote unquote personality types on dominant hemispheres. So there's, people have really gone back and done study after study, but there's plenty of studies that refute it, that really say, no, there isn't a hemispheric dominance. There are brain functions that are more lateralized, but it's not dominant. And I know it might sound subtle to someone who's not in the scientific world or someone who doesn't, even seem to have an interest in scientific journals or whatnot. But it's really important to understand, again, you look at, when there is trauma or a stroke or a head injury or, some of those, really, really serious effects, what happens, other parts of the brain will often take over, or, certain parts of the brain will be damaged and you'll have a deficit for a while, but you can recover or you can partially recover. So Sperry's work really helped us understand again, I was in the middle of it in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. And I, again, feel really, really privileged to, have kind of quote unquote come of age when neuroscience was blossoming more beyond the infancy, right? And at the same time that the home computer and the home office, we could find all kinds of research. I didn't have to run to the library and look at these journals or wait until the journals came out, that I could really have access at my fingertips. But I think at the same time, there was a lot of misunderstanding, and the snowball, just kind of gets stuck, and it's hard to undo what people have these predisposed ideas of. So, mom, dad, caretaker, grandparents, teachers, therapists, you guys all listening to this, keep in mind that Sperry's work helped us understand how different brain regions, quote unquote, mostly controlled on one side or one hemisphere versus the other. But when we really look at what it takes neurologically and developmentally for language, thinking, a kid learning how to climb, building things, problem solving, bike riding, driving a vehicle, all of these are so multifaceted. And that's why we use the term processes, because both hemispheres are contributing to it. Even though speech and language is left hemisphere, it specializes in that. We know this through a lot of different formal testing. For example, I can test young children, between, I guess the testing would start around 3 or 4 for ear dominance, but we as human beings tend, the vast majority of us, to have a right ear dominance for speech and language because that is being stored and acquired on the left hemisphere. But it doesn't mean that the right hemisphere is involved with more of the nonverbal aspects, my pitch, my tone, my facial expressions. And so it again, the fibers that hold the two hemispheres, that's the communication fiber, think of like telecommunication systems, the network, they really are constantly engaged with one another through this processing of data, whether it's visual, auditory, motor, kinesthetic data that's coming into our bodies in this three-dimensional world. So it's very complex. And again, I think what happens over and over and over again is that complex studies, whether it's the news media or educators or someone who's driving an agenda or, a company that wants to sell more product, they take a thread of truth and then really kind of distort it. So I do want to kind of share with you why I am really, really adamant about trying to clarify some of these misunderstandings or these neuromyths, is because what happens is the school systems, the teachers, even, the policymakers or whatnot, they're developing curriculum. They're developing a whole, educational system based on some of or a lot of these information. And so, for example, recently, I think it was recently in the last 5 years, a study showed, questioned 242 teachers. 90% of them agreed wholeheartedly that there was a difference between the left and the right hemisphere, a style of teaching, right? That you have these creatives and you have these logical, analytical thinkers. And yes, we do have proclivities. Human beings are different. And I've said this my whole career, that's what makes mathematicians, artists, designers, cooks, dancers, engineers. We do have a tendency to gravitate toward those things that make us feel good and that we're good at doing. But what I think is happening in everyday classrooms is that if a teacher looks at a child and says, he seems to be a right brainer, he's not going to do very good at math. And so they set up these limiting potential. And then the students themselves begin to internalize this neuromyth, and then they reinforce their own self-advocacy or lack of confidence in this subject matter or that subject matter. And then they downgrade their own abilities or efforts, I have had tons of students who just say, well, I'm not very good at math, or I'm not a very good reader, or, I just simply don't understand how to, do X, Y, Z's. And that's not how my brain works. And I get that we have different styles and different interests. But when we're talking about very young children, 0 to 5, but then 5 to 7 and 7 to 10, these are still young, developing, curious human beings that need to explore a wide variety of opportunities. And we kind of set up our own biases. Maybe we, as an adult, didn't like math, and so we're kind of projecting it on them, or we didn't care for science, or, I'm not a very good, strong reader, the teacher might think. So, nowadays we'll just use technology to help, and they don't really have to become a strong reader, that they can just listen to the books on tape. And again, the brain changes with every learning experience, and we know through functional MRIs that the brain wires itself or rewires itself through neuroplasticity once a young child breaks the code and learns how to read. And So, educational systems I think, are really failing many, many children with these premises that, children have a right dominance or a left dominance as they learn and think and reason. So, just to kind of round out this third myth, there was some studies done at the University of British Columbia. This group of psychologists found that creative thinking activates a widespread neural network, without favoring the left or the right hemisphere. So they really looked at, a series of different activities and that required some creative thinking, and the whole brain or a number of different regions were involved, that it wasn't specialized in the right hemisphere or the left hemisphere. And that's another thing when it comes to, breaking the code to literacy. We now know through functional MRIs how when a child is struggling at learning how to read, that the whole brain is jumping in, trying to figure this out. And yet when we compare that to, the young brain, whether they're 6 or 8 or 10, that with that person who is a fluent reader, that brain processes is much more organized, and that there are different parts that are sharing the data, and it is partially visual, but it's mostly auditory. And I will have further episodes about that, because that's really kind of my jam, where we look at the speech development, the language processing development, and how that lays the foundation to literacy and what that connection is. But on today's, episode, I'm really kind of focusing on the fact that the brain, we use 100% of our brain, not simultaneously, but there are organized pathways and systems that get more and more fine-tuned as we practice throughout our young adulthood. Okay, so now we have 2 more brain myths, which really I'm kind of building up to number 4 and number 5 that are kind of big. And this is the one that has been a thorn in my side my entire career, or almost my entire career. And that is that your child's brain is 85% developed by age 3. You can Google any state early intervention website, and it is all over it. Any school website, preschool website, it's all over that. Your little toddler's brain is fully, quote unquote, developed by age 3. And it is so incredibly misunderstood, misleading, and really harmful. Please don't get me wrong. I am not suggesting that those first 3 years don't matter, because they do. They absolutely do. I've spent, over 3 decades trying to understand that early language processing and brain development to improve the health and well-being of the most young, the most vulnerable, and to empower parents just like you of what can we do on an everyday basis to help support healthy growth and learning. But with that in mind, early intervention, the concept of it exploded. And, therefore, daycare centers, preschool centers, and it was under this pressure that the school system, quote unquote, is a system that they can do it better than mom and dad, or they can do it better than your neighborhood. And parents over time has kind of been brought into, or they've bought into this concept. Remember, I said that babies are born still under construction. In order to survive the birth canal, mom and baby kind of, through the evolutionary process said, okay, 9 months, I think it's like 280 days in this womb, the average head can survive through the birth canal without killing mom or harming baby. And yes, it's labor and it's a struggle, but that also means that those next 3 years are pretty remarkable. You have your little toddler or your little baby who, knows nothing at birth. And by the time he or she hits their 3rd birthday, they're having full conversations with you that they can negotiate and, really navigate the playground and tell stories and be funny. Is it 100% clear and 100% perfect? No, but it's pretty darn close. And so it's a remarkable developmental process, but what happens really is in those first 3 years, and this is what the research indicates, is that the physical volume size of the head is at about 80 to 85%, quote unquote, finished. And it's just the physical structure of the adult. You compare a 3-year-old head volume. That's why when you go to those well baby checkups, the first thing they do is measure the head circumference to make sure that the skull is expanding. Remember, you have a soft spot on the top of your head to expand the growth because the brain is going to continue to grow in size. And yes, they're learning remarkable stuff in those first 36 months, but they're not done learning. They're not done developing a higher understanding of how the world works or thinking or even language, right? Compare a 3-year-old language with a 5-year-old language is remarkably different. And then that 5-year-old to a 7-year-old, again, remarkably different. And so I just really, at every chance I can get, I try to explain to educators and parents and pediatricians and psychologists that we can't take this sweeping generalization that, 85% of a child's brain is fully developed by 3. No, it's just the volume. It's the size. And so why I feel so passionate about this particular brain myth is because what I've seen happen in 35 years with parents, with a wide variety of school systems at the pre-K level, at the kindergarten through elementary, mostly 3rd and 4th grade, but public schools, private schools, the people who fund these schools, is that they look at that 3-year-old and if you aren't average or if you aren't kind of holding your own, and believe me, I can look at a 3-year-old and have a pretty good clinical judgment of what the future is going to hold for him or her based on speech and language, based on their interpersonal communication skills, based on their ability to navigate this world. But these school systems look at that 3-year-old, and if there are issues or developmental gaps, then, they really give you a label, put you in a box, categorize you. And, I think parents then feel like their child is stuck and there's not a whole heck of a lot of hope that they're always going to be, have sensory processing disorder or have, slow processing time or their attention deficit disorder, all of these disorders, these diagnoses. And yes, I am, a diagnostician by trade. I understand that we have to understand these clusters of behaviors, and so we can help, right? So we can really support and close these gaps. But I think the school systems, based on early intervention or lack thereof, but really pass judgment on this particular child. And it's been very challenging for educators and policymakers in the educational environment to truly understand what this brain-based learning, language-based learning really means. I think it's because the training with neuroscientists and clinicians like myself compared to educators and policymakers in the educational world, that we just come at it from 2 entirely different forms of, background knowledge, and even the semantics are different. And I think like I mentioned earlier, that you look at the scientific research, or you listen to a summary of the research, and then the media will often pull, a misquote or oversimplify very complex results and impressions, and that's what that's what kind of hits the front mainstream, on the newspapers or the social media or the schools. And then you have this vagueness, and you generalize it to every kid, every classroom, every educator, system who's paying for this program or paying for that program. And then things become sensationalized that, the whole campaign, the whole policy push is about that early intervention, which, again, please don't misquote me. It is important, and it tells us a lot about where the child is, but it's not the be-all and end-all by his third birthday. And that's the other big shift, like who's going to pay for this stuff, right? So the state, if your child does have developmental delays, or you have concerns, and you reach out to, if you don't reach out to someone private like me, then you reach out to the state, because that's where some of your tax dollars go to. And that's, quote unquote free, and they'll come to your home and they'll help you. But as soon as your child hits that third birthday, what happens? Boom, you get, then bumped over to the public educational system, and that money, then that funding is something entirely different. So I guess you can go with the old saying, follow the money, or, who is really driving this message, and who is really in charge, and what are they really looking at in helping the child close those gaps and build, a lifelong foundation to learning and social development. So, as kind of a recap, I know I'm approaching number 5, but that we only use 10% of our brain is not true. Playing classical music for infants makes them smarter, not true. That some people are right-brained and more creative, and some people are left-brained, more logical. It's not a dominance, that you do have a preference sometimes, and that there is lateralization between the two hemispheres, but it's not a clinical definition and dominance. And then number 4, that your child's brain is 85% developed by age 3 is just simply not possible. So number 5 is, and this is kind of a relatively newbie and I think this could actually be one of the hardest to bust. And it's when school people state, students learn better when their teaching style matches the student's learning style. I'm sure we even say it, us grownups, right? The 20-something that kind of grew up with this neuromyth or brain myth, and the 30 and 40. I mean, we all say, oh, I'm a better visual learner, I'm a better auditory learner. And the truth is, there's absolutely no scientific evidence to support this. And I first heard this maybe 10 years ago through Dr. Paula Talal, who's a neuroscientist and clinical psychologist. And, she, I really, admire her and respect her work, but she was kind of sharing that there was kind of this big aha moment in the scientific community that there's just no evidence to support that students' learning styles need to match the teaching styles, or that we benefit in a learning environment based on how the information is presented. So let me explain, because I know a lot of you are probably shaking your head and saying, no, that's not true. I'm an auditory learner. I'm a visual learner. So let me explain what the research suggests, and then how it's been, generalized into everyday people, everyday lives, the classrooms, and us as adults even. So how the myth goes is that a child's way of learning or children's ways of learning are different, fundamentally different, and require different educational practices. And the vast majority of the studies that are trying to look at this have been in Europe and in Asia, but in the last few years, there's been some here in the United States where they've exclusively studied teachers' perceptions, and that close to 96% of teachers believe this neuromyth to be absolutely true, that a child has a learning style, and therefore I have to modify or adapt my teaching style in order for them to benefit and learn and acquire new knowledge. However, there are very few studies that even have investigated this thought, whether you should change your teaching methods or your teaching program to positively impact or enhance a student's outcome. And then apparently those studies that did use some valid or sound methodology program trying to look at teaching style versus students' benefit demonstrated actually the opposite. So I found that very fascinating when I dug a little bit deeper on the background or the history of this. So, for example, in 2006 at the University of California in Santa Barbara, they found absolutely no benefit. In 2009, where there was a paper review, or they reviewed all the so-called studies, they weren't able to find one study that upheld that claim. And then what they do kind of generally say is that there's a broad principle of where everyone seems to learn better. And it's really kind of, for lack of a better word, kind of an eclectic approach. But with that in mind, there are definitely, and again, in my career, starting in the mid-1990s, where neuroscience really looked at how the brain changes under certain conditions, we know that certain things like repetition, the intensity, positive reinforcement, spacing out learning sessions, because what the brain needs to do, and we've all done this, say you're trying to work through a problem, or you're trying to write something, or your brain is kind of struggling. If you walk away, go pet the dog, or get a drink of water, or go for a run, or, cook dinner, you change it, then the brain kind of settles down, and we're able to then come back to it with clarity and a clear direction of what we want to do. And that's true for young kids too, whether you're, 5 or 15. There's also one of the things that we've learned in the last 25, 30 years through neuroscience is the 80-20 rule, that the brain needs a lot of repetition. And I think we know this. You can't play baseball once and then become a pro, right? You can't sit down at the piano and do a couple of chords and say, okay, I'm good. I've done this. I'm a good pianist. You can't call yourself a pianist after a couple of lessons. You need repetition. And I think, and this is my bias, but I think what has happened on the educational area is that teachers get bored with repetition, and it's hard. And I mean, as a therapist, I can do the same thing over and over every single freaking day and every single freaking week. But I understand the need for repetition. And so I try to change it up just a little bit. And so the 80-20 rule is really when you have 80% of repetition, and then you have to change something a little bit. The brain has to stretch itself. Otherwise, it gets bored. So it's sort of like if you get 60% correct and 40% wrong, then that's too defeating, right? And if you get 100% right all the time, then I'm not learning anything and I'm just going through the motions. But that 80-20 where I'm being positively reinforced and then I up it a notch. So we do know that there are these broad principles that everyone seems to learn better in, but there's not a learning style. And if we think about the really little kids, that when we're really helping them develop, study habits and learning habits, it is important to show through a variety of mediums, whether it's visual and auditory and kinesthetic, because they're learning so much every single day. So just consider all of this, that, while some students seem to prefer visual, auditory, kinesthetic learning over the other, there's really no credible scientific data to suggest that there's a benefit in teaching them to their preferred learning style. I still come from the school of thought that it's just great to move it up and show different mediums or different modalities, and that a really good teacher finds a variety of ways to keep the students engaged. And, I did spend several years, it was kind of the hardest part of my career, in a high school here as an autism specialist. But I was in a wide variety of classes, and, the good teachers, stayed up on really developing a wide variety of interests and engaging the kids through different channels. And remember what these, kind of internal biases can take hold, that the students themselves hear this over and over again. Oh, I'm an auditory learner, or, I need to get up and move. And we all need these things. And I know that when I am learning something new and I'm reading it, sometimes I have to read it out loud so I get that auditory input. Or sometimes, I have to stand up and read it. There's a wide variety of tools or variety of techniques, that's the word I was looking for, that really help keep us engaged and then process that information. The main point here, I know that a lot of you are, again, shaking your head and perhaps disagreeing, but I'm not saying that it's an absolute. I'm just simply saying that what's being refuted is that deeply held belief, matching the teachers to the individual students, that there's no evidence to support that as of today. There might be in the future, we don't know. And remember, that's what science is all about, right? I'm not saying there are absolutes. I'm just saying what the scientific community has helped us understand to date. So science is never settled. Science is meant to be questioned and tested and replicated. And like I've said numerous times on this particular episode, that people have tried to replicate previous studies from the 60s or the 80s or the 90s, and then we haven't been able to replicate that. That is telling us that perhaps it's not as solid as the initial impression. So as conclusion, the reasons why I keep bringing up these neuromyths, these brain myths, and trying to bust them for parents, for teachers, is that, I think kids are being affected, and that we're not necessarily meeting them where their needs are, and that there's, because of a big push over the last 20 years about making education, quote unquote, more science-based, and there's still teachers that look at me cross-eyed and say, what the heck are you talking about, if I get a little too nerdy for them. because I think the jargon, the professional jargon with educators versus clinicians and us, people working outside of the educational domain speak a different language. Our background knowledge, our expertise is different. And then there are these, we tend to take these simple explanations for very complex processes. And sometimes you can't connect, 1 + 1 = 2 when you look at things in the lab or look things through, a scientific experiments and then apply it to everyday kids in everyday classrooms, and make these sweeping generalizations. So that's my point, is that we have to be careful of what we think and how it's affecting our parenting, our clinical work, our education, and then our society at large, boxing kids into these categories with these labels and not giving them the opportunity to really explore a wide variety of learning, experiences. So that's it for my top 5 brain myth busters. And I hope you enjoyed this episode, found it at least, stimulating and some food for thought. Thanks so much for hanging out with me again on this particular Tuesday. I know your time is precious, and I really, really appreciate you listening and thinking and holding some time for me. So if you would be so kind, please share this episode or the entire podcast with a friend, perhaps a new mom or expectant mom or dad, or even your childcare provider, because I think it's really helpful to spread this word, and that I feel like I have had an exceptional career in private practice, but there's a limit to the numbers of families that I can reach on a one-to-one basis privately in my practice. And what I want to do is really reach as many parents as possible, thousands upon thousands, hopefully, through this podcast and through future programs, because I know you feel alone. You don't know what to do sometimes. You doubt yourself, your own gut instinct, and you listen to the quote unquote experts in the educational system, and yet some of it just doesn't feel right. So, I know you're looking and your friends are looking for some solid advice, some clarity through all of this clutter, all of this noise. And so if you know someone who could use a little guidance, please share this podcast with them. Share this episode and let them know they're not alone, that we're striving for better parent information, more empowerment, right from home. So, all right, my dear friends, thank you so much for tuning in. Make sure that you follow Talking Toddlers on your favorite platform. And if you would, leave a review. If you love what you're hearing and you want to know more of this, then please leave a review, and then you'll get notified when the next one comes out every Tuesday. Talking Toddlers on Tuesdays. And please enjoy the rest of your week with your little ones. Keep it simple, guys. It doesn't have to get fancy. And and I know that the most important thing is the family, and that they need you more than anyone or anything else. So bless you, and see you next week. Bye-bye.